Our first session for today is a conversation titled Roots of Power, Feudal Foundations and Modern Economies. And it's a pleasure to welcome artists Olivia Plender and social anthropologist Celia Plender. This session will be moderated by Zeynep Öz, independent curator, and Sharjah Biennial 16 co-curator. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming here. I have the Plenders over here, Celia Plender and Olivia Plender. So I'm just going to introduce very briefly Olivia and Celia. Olivia Plender is an artist based in Stockholm and London. Her artworks are based on social history, and recent projects explore the relationships between gender, power, and authority. Celia Plender is a social anthropologist based in the UK. Her work looks at experiences of political economic change in Britain from the perspective of community projects and engages with themes including cooperativism, care, and alternative economic practices. Welcome with that introduction. I've known Olivia actually for a very long time. I was a student back in 2000. I don't remember the date. I think it was some.
Okay, how's that? Better, yeah. But 2008, I think we met, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And then afterwards, we sort of got together again when I was doing a series of studio visits and residency. So I've known Olivia for a long time. And her work has been influential in my thinking and sort of exploration and research. And about 5 years ago, during the pandemic, we were very randomly starting to talk and think about the way that the pandemic brought people together and made them talk to one another. We had a very long talk. At that time, I was really interested in food and farming. I was living on a farm because of the pandemic. And I was telling her about how I'm interested in like food systems and what's going around and economic systems. And between all of that, she told me two things. One of them was that I have to read Homage to Catalonia, a George Orwell book. So she sent me in a direction that became super influential to this project that I did actually at Sharjah Biennial 16, so she is one of the influences. And then she also introduced me to her sister. She told me, you have to meet my sister, Celia. So for the past 5 years, I've actually talked and spoke to Celia more than Olivia. And the conversations that we had together, the first one of which we actually recorded back in 2000 or 2001, and we tried to re-record it as a podcast this year, but we decided that the original one was better. And then afterwards, as a producer, she spoke to two other people during that podcast series, and those can be shown in Gallery 1. And then Olivia's work, I'm sure for those of you who've seen it, are also in Gallery 1. So I just wanted this conversation to be about some of the crossovers in their works, because literally in that talk, actually, when I was talking to you 5 years ago, you did tell me we do think a lot through a lot of these ideas. You do have to talk to Celia. I asked her, have you ever publicly talked to one another? She said, never, hopefully one day. So I'm really glad that I think your works are very much in conversation, at least for me. It really, talking to both of you brought a lot of these ideas that I parsed through in that Gallery 1, a lot about economic systems, a lot about the way that people come together and think about alternative systems of living and governance, and then also this idea of the political imaginary that you and I talked about a lot, which is also in your work. Those have been very influential for me in thinking about this project for the biennial. So I was really happy that they sat in somewhat of a close proximity in the gallery spaces where you can talk about them. So that's my sort of an anecdotal introduction to this conversation right here, but I'm actually going to give it over to you guys, to both of you, to maybe, Olivia, you can start with the work that you're showing in the galleries, just to like recap about the work, but then sort of I would love for you to situated within your practice a little bit so that we have a starting point. And then I'm going to turn over to you and I'll ask you to do the same with the podcasts, just to summarize what we sort of did with that one, but then also to situate it with your practice as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so some of you might have seen the work, but what I'm showing in the biennial is 2 series of works, and they're both quite old. Like, it's work that I made mostly around 2007, 2008. And my work usually deals with social history in different ways. And these 2 works, one is a board game, and it's called Set Sail for the Levant. And it looks at, both works look at different moments of huge social, economic change and upheaval, like these sort of moments when the system really changes, and the sort of social consequences of that. So the board game is mainly about an event called the land enclosures, or the enclosures of the commons. And I'm from Britain, and that happened, that's a process that happened over hundreds of years, but it started in the early modern period in the 17th century. And it was basically where kind of the common people, like the commoners, as they were known, the sort of normal people, lost their rights of access to the land, and the land became privatized, and sort of it was the beginning of capitalism. So suddenly people lost their rights to, kind of collect wood in the forest for firewood, or graze their sheep on the local common, And then it's one of the things that pushed people into the Industrial Revolution, So kind of traditional lifestyles became unsustainable. And then kind of people ended up having to migrate to cities, and then became the workers of the Industrial Revolution. And at the time, this was referred to as internal colonization. And it was also about controlling and subduing the people, pushing people into a money economy rather than a barter economy. And then it was basically the system that was exported around the world as, part of British colonialism, same process. So that was the first work, and then the second work is a series which was about a British social movement called the Kibbo Kift, and there's a whole series of drawings. There's a diagram of this economic theory called social credit that they were interested in, and there's a series of colourful costumes which are based on the costumes that they wore back in the 1920s. So the Kibbo Kift was an offshoot of the Boy Scout movement. So it was a camping movement. And it was a group of scouts originally who got together with a group of feminists, and they also got together with people from the cooperative movement. And they were very, very disillusioned after the First World War, and they wanted to build a new society, a sort of, they had a kind of utopian vision for what they wanted society to be. And then it was an educational movement, you could say, but they were, kind of doing the things that Boy Scouts do, but, very interested in arts and crafts, very interested in ideas about gender equality, and also trying out all these economic ideas. And then I was working on both these pieces back in 2007, 2008, around the time of the financial crisis, so it was the big sort of economic crash that was already building up in 2007, and then sort of, there was the big crash in October 2008. And kind of what I was thinking about was the parallels between then and now. So with the Kibbo Kift, after the economic crisis of 1929 and the Great Depression, they really sort of transformed and kind of got more and more into, this idea of social credit, this kind of economic theory, which has good sides and bad sides. There's sort of interesting ideas contained within it, and then there's some very problematic ideas contained within it. But they became a uniformed group. So they sort of dropped the utopianism, and then they kind of took to the streets and started marching as part of the hunger marches. There were these huge hunger marches in the UK at the time because of the poverty of the economic crisis. So I was sort of using that as a way of talking about what was happening in the moment when I was making the work. And my work tends to use history in that way. So I do a lot of research about different social movements from the past, and I'm very interested in group dynamics. I'm very interested in how group identities are formed, and very interested in sort of power structures, social structures. And I sort of tend to kind of look at history in order to talk about the present, you know, and sometimes looking at the seeds of things we see in the present, and other times using the past in a more allegorical sense, you know. Yeah.
And as Zeynep has said, with the work that I've been involved with that's in the show, it revolves around these 3 interviews. So there's the first one, that Zeynep interviewed me, and that was specifically around a long-term project that I've done with community food cooperatives in London. And the 2 projects that I worked with very intensively come out of quite different political periods within the UK. So one is a project that was set up by anarchists, squatters and leftists during the Thatcher years, you know, so very much responding to Margaret Thatcher's conservative regime and setting up a kind of activism that responded to that. And then the other project was set up during the New Labour years, and that one, you know, that's a period where we're seeing an intensification of neoliberalisation in the UK, and we're seeing the ways in which welfare services are being withdrawn and communities are expected to kind of fill in those gaps. And so this was a project that was set up in a community centre as, you know, as part of this logic around communities looking after themselves. So selling fresh fruit and vegetables as a way of thinking about nutritional health and access to good food. And so we talked a lot about that, and we talked about themes within that work, which were a lot around everyday politics, ideas of mutual aid, care, welfare. And then with the other 2 interviews, I then sort of snowballed from there to talk to other academics that have been influential to me and who resonate with some of the themes in my own work. And so one of those was a social policy scholar called Eleanor Jupp. And she's worked a lot in a similar time period, so sort of, well, the later time period actually, so 2000s onward, working a lot with community projects, voluntary sector, and also asking these questions around, you know, what's the impact of neoliberalisation? How do we do politics today? What constitutes activism? You know, how do we do that in this kind of environment? And then the other one was with a sociologist and a critical theorist, and there we were thinking about some of the bigger ideas of social transformation and what happens, you know, within theories such as socialism. How do we make those more tangible? You know, and there he also thinks about cooperatives as sort of one of the ways in which we can, you know, we can enact certain forms of politics and try and make ideas such as the ideas of Karl Marx more tangible and more doable in the everyday, and we can learn through doing and start to imagine through the ways in which we do stuff. And so, yeah, so that's what we worked on together. And in terms of how that sits within my practice more broadly, so yeah, as I say, I've done this long-term research with community food cooperatives, very much thinking around these ideas of everyday politics. And more broadly, my work, as Zeynep said at the beginning, is thinking about experiences of political and economic change. You know, so I continue to work with other community projects. I continue to think about, you know, including sort of what happened during the pandemic. We have a cost of living crisis in the UK at the moment. How are all of those things playing out in the everyday? How are they affecting people's lives, and how are they pushing back on those kind of things? You know, what is this slippery place between activism and sort of neoliberalisation? So yeah.
I'm going to ask you to expand very quickly. I'm going to ask you to say it in 2 minutes, what you did a whole thesis on, and now, which is coming out as a book. This comparative study between 2 food co-ops is what you're looking at. And I want you to like very briefly summarize it, because I think that comparison and the fact that historically where it fits and what you're trying to do is something that you both have in common. So I just want you to like materialize that a little bit so we can like go from there.
Sure. So yeah, so as I mentioned, there were the 2 projects that came out of these different historical periods. And from that, you know, there were very much responses to the period that they were starting in, and that shaped their values, their politics, and their structures, you know, and the power dynamics within them. So that the more anarchist one was very much a horizontal project, you know, no leaders, everyone trying to make decisions together. And the community center project was much more top down. You know, there is a paid coordinator and then voluntary workers. And that really structured decision making quite differently. So all of those kind of power dynamics within that are a really significant part of this, as well as that issue of, you know, how are they experiencing these significant moments in political economic history in the UK.
And I think like one thing that is very like, both of your works are very historically informed. It's based in historical research at the end of the day. And we've talked about this. I think you would both say that that kind of historical research is a way of sort of trying to decipher and understand the contemporary economic conditions, very specifically austerity measures that you were doing all of this work in. So I think what I would like, maybe I would like for you to, we've talked about the suffragette movement and how that is something that you're working with right now. And I think maybe you can take it from that. And I just, I think this community focus and how you're trying to bring it into your work has a lot of parallels in the same material. So I want you to talk about that with like a specific example of how it comes up in your own works. So as to see your way of thinking through it and your different practices also, because I'm gonna bring it to like disciplinarity and also how you're trying to maneuver through this. But if we can talk about one of these examples, I think that would be very...
Shall I start?
Please.
Yeah, so kind of, as I mentioned, these works that are on show here are quite old. You know, so when I was making these works almost 20 years ago, I was doing a lot of research in archives, you know, looking at social movements in archives. And then at some point, I started to desire to meet, you know, actual social movements in the present tense. You know, and feel like I should step out of the archives. But this coincided with Celia training as a social anthropologist. So, you know, kind of when I first started thinking about that, you know, it was unclear to me how to go about that. So I stole all my methods from Celia, basically. And kind of like, while she was doing her sort of master's and then PhD in social anthropology, you know, I was following very, very closely, you know, what she was up to and sort of becoming interested in, you know, kind of the methods around, you know, how you do ethnography. You know, there's methods like participant observation, you know, this idea of spending time in the contexts in which, you know, kind of people spend time, you know, with communities, you know, kind of, but, you know, participant observation, so both participating and observing, you know. And then I ended up doing, in more recent years, I've been doing this long project that was about the British suffragette movement, so the Votes for Women campaign in the early 20th century. And I decided to kind of look at that movement through the eyes of contemporary feminists and women's organizations. And so I was working in London, which is where we're from, and I ended up approaching, you know, a whole network of different women's centers and feminist groups. And then I ended up with two different organizations, both of whom had an interest in that history already. And one was called Crossroads Women's Center, which was originally founded by a group of women, including a well-known American feminist called Selma James. And then the other was a housing activist group called Focus East 15 in East London. And what I was interested in was the suffragette movement and this whole kind of campaign for votes for women in the UK. It's very, very well known in certain senses. You know, it gets, you know, kind of, for example, you know, kind of when there was the centenary of women winning the vote in the UK, you know, there was many celebrations, you know, kind of, you know, government ministers giving speeches about how great it, you know, that history was. And what we're sort of familiar with is often these, you know, there's these images of militancy. There's a lot of images of, you know, kind of, you know, they were doing a lot of, you know, really sort of militant activism, you know, smashing windows, you know, being arrested by the police. But there's also all these other things they were doing that aren't so well known that I was interested in. So they were kind of, many of these suffragette groups were fighting for a much bigger transformation of society than what we're taught in school when you study that movement in school. So I found a play written by a woman called Sylvia Pankhurst, who was one of the, kind of activists in the suffragette movement. And she was running a group in East London, close to where we're from, who were campaigning on, issues around housing, bad housing, equal pay for men and women, food poverty, and a lot of stuff that just felt very contemporary, and sort of issues that are really important right now in Britain, have sort of, because we have this very strong sense at the moment in the UK that very 19th century conditions are returning. There was sort of the welfare state in the 20th century, now that's being rolled back. Poverty is increasing. So it was this real sort of sense of conditions returning. And so I approached these women's centers and feminist groups, and together we workshopped this play. I sort of used this play by Sylvia Pankhurst, written around 1913, which talks about the struggle of the suffragettes. And I worked with a theatre director and a group of actors as well, all of whom do a lot of community theatre. And together with the women, I would sort of set up these workshops, and we would sort of, read the play, rewrite the play, write our own sort of scripts based on the play, about contemporary situations, and a project sort of emerged out of that. So in terms of the use of theatre, I mean, that's very different from Celia, that's not something she does, but the kind of, I borrowed a lot of methods in terms of how you build up a relationship with a community group, and sort of, kind of being kind of this position where you're not an outsider coming in, you are one of the group, you're kind of there with the group, doing the things the group does, and very much also talking about my own struggles, being someone from London, living through this time period, and then the sort of theatre methods came from, kind of more the history of community theatre, a little bit from the Brazilian theatre director Augusto Boal, who's, very well known, and his sort of forum theatre methods. So we were sort of borrowing, methods from all over the place in terms of how you work with, communities and groups.
Interesting. I remember one of the questions that I asked you, because you're talking about the housing situation, one of the questions I asked you in the podcast is, how did you end up doing the food co-ops? And you tell your biography of having lived in the housing co-ops, and then naturally the next step is to look at food co-ops, and that's how you go. And then a next question I ask, how can you be within the food co-op and you're interacting with these characters? Because you have very specific characters in the thesis that you actually interact with. How can you interact with them and not take a stand? And there you tell me something, and I want you to repeat that because it's about your methodology exactly. You're like, I'm not a...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do take a stand, is the answer that I gave you, right? I frame my research as engaged research. I think a lot of anthropologists working with activists will say that they're working in an engaged way. It's often around issues that you're interested in, you're part of something. And to me, if you're using these kind of methods of participant observation that Olivia was talking about, it's about being a part of something, trying to understand it from the inside. So if you're working with a non-hierarchical group, and part of the things that you're trying to understand is how do people make decisions? What are the power dynamics of here? Where are, what's happening? What kind of informal power structures are developing? You kind of have to be a part of that, And so yeah. So I as Zeynep said, I lived in a housing co-op. A lot of unofficial leaders popped up. The dynamics were really, really complex. So I chose not to stay living there, but I was left with a lot of questions. The cooperative as a model was something that I was still really, really interested in. I also used to work as a chef and a food writer. And so, that's what, through doing that work and kind of feeling like I wanted to take my work on food in a more political direction, that's how I got into anthropology. And so then, I started to see post-2008 there was a bit of a surge in food cooperative activity. So it was sort of an interesting way to put together these interests and to work on something that I really cared about, but kind of had things that I wanted to work out about. I wanted to know what was going on, but also how did that feel? What did it mean to be a part of that? How can you understand it from the inside and also work in a way that's trying to support and facilitate the activities of the groups that you work with? And so, yeah, kind of really moving away from the more traditional idea of trying to be an objective researcher who leaves no trace, you know. Because to me also those methods, I think, and increasingly for a lot of people, those can be extractive. You know, if you're working in a context where you're seeing people working on an issue you care about, but also people struggling, you know, and you want to point out some of the big structural pieces that are leading to that, then it felt important to have a stake in that. It felt important ethically as well as intellectually to have a stake in that.
And I think it's the same, you know, it's the same debates within the field of socially engaged practice where I'm situated, you know, these days partially, you know, because this whole discussion about sort of, you know, if you're working with different community groups, you know, how do you create a relationship to them which is not extractive, you know? And kind of it's a very complicated, you know, social relations are very complicated. There's a lot of sort of ethical dilemmas. There's a lot of power dynamics that you have to negotiate, you know. But sort of the, you know, kind of being, I think, kind of in a way like anthropology kind of, or the kind of anthropology that you do has, for me, provided a lot of those conversations around the ethical dilemmas of socially engaged practice, you know, that I've then managed to bring into my own practice, you know.
Yeah, and I think as Zeynep was saying at the beginning, and as you said as well, we talk a lot, you know. I mean, I think with some of the work that you were doing during the austerity period, I mean, there were so many overlaps, you know, with how I understand the everyday politics of the projects that I work about. It also resonates with sort of what the suffragettes were doing around mutual aid, the East End suffragettes were doing around mutual aid, you know, and the cooperative movement as well has this long history. You know, it was 1844, the first sort of official cooperative movement started in the UK. And the work of that original consumer food cooperative is still really significant in terms of the kind of the principles of cooperation, not only in the UK but around the world. The Rochdale principles still get used. So there too, you know, there's this methodology around looking at historical things, seeing how things are happening in the here and now, and also with the stages of capitalism. I mean, Zeynep, that's something we've talked about a lot, isn't it? You know, a cooperative historically has been a response to capitalism and still is, you know, so all of these small projects I'm working with, they're thinking, well, how do we do the economy differently, you know, and responding to that moment in capitalism.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to, I mean, also to, how do you do anthropology differently, or how do you do, you know, socially engaged art differently, you know? And this, I was thinking to, you know, to return to this thing about this idea of extractivism. I mean, one thing that I think both of us have thought about a lot when we've been working with community groups is making sure that there's some kind of exchange, that there's reciprocity, you know, that we're not just coming in, you know, from the outside asking for something, taking up time, you know, but rather kind of, I mean, in the context of my practice, it's always been very important that if I'm working with a group, that, you know, kind of there's something that they want out of the project. You know, and with the two groups I work with in London, they both had this existing relationship to that history. You know, so to give an example, you know, I spoke to many, many different feminist groups in London, trying to find groups who might be interested in this subject. But when I went to these particular groups, you know, I remember going for a meeting at Crossroads Women's Centre, and in their reception area, they have a sort of wall of photographs of like feminist heroines, and I saw Sylvia Pankhurst up there, and then I was like, oh, okay, maybe this will go all right. You know, I think these people are interested in what I have to offer. You know, and then they were also very interested in both groups had some kind of relationship to, you know, kind of culture and theatre, and sort of the housing activist group Focus East 15. You know, they'd already been using theatre and sort of, you know, kind of there had been a, you know, play that they were involved with about their struggle. And they were very interested in how they could communicate their ideas through cultural forms, you know, and wanted to learn more about theatre and art and sort of cultural forms. So there was an exchange, and I think that's very important. And then your sort of engaged anthropology is also about an exchange, you know, rather than coming and taking knowledge or taking time.
I think I'm gonna, because we're gonna be wrapping up, I think actually that was what I was gonna ask you, but I think maybe we can wrap it up very anecdotally, and we never came to the political imaginary, but it is actually like what I want you to just very quickly touch upon is what we were talking about yesterday, how like one of your students came in and sort of like you were thinking about how they, like what you're doing in terms of your teaching and their activism overlaps. Maybe that is where like some of these political imaginaries are actually finding body in the same way that you're talking about it. So maybe we can finish up with that.
Yeah. So I'm currently teaching a course about social movements and collective action. And a lot of it's sort of, as well as being based on the literature, it's based on what I've learned from being in those spaces and being one of the people enacting a certain kind of politics there. And within that, I think, yeah, opening up political imaginations is so important. Thinking about how we imagine differently and how we might be able to get to other places by thinking it's possible to get there, right? And doing things that help us learn the shape it might take. But one of my students is very, very involved with various kinds of activism at my university at the moment. And as a young activist, she's learning a lot, you know, and in this class, I'm constantly saying, you know, well, you need to reflect, you need to reflect, you need to think about the tactics you're using, but don't just do stuff, you know, talk about it, think about the process as well, which I think in something like non-hierarchical organizing, cooperativism, you have to have that space for conversation because that's how you kind of manage some of these issues around things like unofficial leaders or doing things in less inclusive ways or whatever else it might be. And yeah, no, it's been lovely to see her to do this, you know, and use this as a space of reflection on all the activism that she's currently doing.
Thank you. That is a good wrap up of like actually like a very similar approach. I think you start from very different places, but at the end of the day, it's been like pleasure, like seeing how you navigate those waters and then the outcome in a way, that's what I was telling you. The outcome is very different and then in the end, you were like, actually, it's very similar. So it's great to hear about that, but thank you so much.
Thank you.